We are training the next generation to meet the strategic challenges of tomorrow. We are dedicated to understanding in order to act better.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Justin Massie. I'm professor of political science at the University of Quebec, Montreal, and co-director of the Network for Strategic Analysis. And I'm pleased to welcome you back to this conference on Is a War Over Taiwan Coming? We'll move to our second panel this afternoon, entitled How Are Allies, Regional Allies, Handling the Taiwan Question? And I have the pleasure of chairing this panel of distinguished experts. We will begin with Stephen Jackson's presentation. He's a professor of political science at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. We'll follow on by H.J. Yu, who is associate professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul, Korea. And the panel will end with John Blaxland, who is a professor of international security and intelligence studies at the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at Australian National University. It's a pleasure to have you all today on this panel, and I'll give you about 15 minutes to make your presentation, and then we'll have a lot of time for discussions with the audience online and with the audience in person. Thank you.
Presenting as the first person after lunch is that everybody's always getting a little bit sleepy and the blood sugar is low. So I'm going to be talking about defending a country that doesn't exist with a military that isn't allowed, which is the Japan-Taiwan defense relations and potential role. I'm going to also start with basically 5 points, one of which should hopefully wake you up in the afternoon. That is, I don't think we have until 2049, and I don't think we have 10 to 20 years. I think we have 5 years. 5 years before something is going to happen very seriously in the Taiwan Strait. And it does mean, it doesn't mean that I disagree with things that Bonnie and John and others said, but I really think that we're dealing with a tighter timeline than we had there. Now, most of you are probably aware that Japan has a constitution. It was written by the United States in 1947. 3 years later, we immediately regretted writing Article 9, Section 2, that said that Japan is not allowed a military. And so we came up with a method of dealing with that. That is, they don't have a military, they have a jiantai, which is a Japan self-defense force. It's not an army. Don't call it an army. They get offended when you do that. Since then, there have been a number of steps that have been made to take Japan forward. I'm going to be talking about that. But the second point I want to make is that Japan is the essential ally in dealing with Taiwan. In many ways, almost as important, if not more so, than the United States. Because if something happens fast in Taiwan, and I think it will happen fast in Taiwan, then Japan's response is absolutely essential for what will happen there. Third, I think that Japan has been gradually moving toward a regular military power, and that it has been moving toward an implicit but not explicit security assurance for Taiwan, and that it will have a great deal to do with how well things turn out. Now, Japan has, come on. Okay, great, thank you. Japan has been moving fairly gradually over the years toward a much more engaged military, not just a purely jieitai. And indeed, in 2007, it moved from what was then called the Bo'eicho, the Self-Defense Agency, to the Bo'eishou, which is a Ministry of Defense. And this was considered quite symbolic. It created a National Security Council in 2017, the Kokai Anzen Hosho Kaigi, and then started participating in Afghanistan and Iraq. They started arms sales in 2014, though they haven't sold much yet. And probably most important was a reinterpretation of what Article 9 means in their constitution, which allows for the protection of other countries. And that specifically meant that if an armed attack against a foreign country that is in a close relationship with Japan occurs, and as a result threatens Japan's survival and poses a clear danger, then it can invoke its right to self-defense for someone else's behalf. Of course, all this is occurring in the background of this. This is the rise of China economically since basically since I was born, and it has been truly impressive. We all know this, but the implication is that China has had its military spending rise dramatically above that of Japan and Taiwan combined. And what's really scary about this, and we were talking about this earlier this morning, only one of those years did China spend more than 2% of its gross domestic product on its military defense. Every other year has been below 2%. So if they wanted to really ramp up their spending, it is entirely possible that they could do so. Now, this has led to a fairly unfavorable opinion of China around the world. And I particularly want to point out that the Australians, with due respect, John, used to be fairly mild about China, and their unfavorables were in the 30% range. And then thanks to a number of actions, we've had Australian public opinion turn sour on China. But if you take a look, Japan has always been sour on China. So the public opinion side of Japan since the 21st century has really been fairly negative. It's not hard to see why. Of course, we've all heard about the Senkaku-Diaoyu dispute. It's a territorial dispute that's sadly oftentimes treated as some sort of a separated issue in the press. But in fact, if you take a look at the satellite, you can see that in fact, it's right by Taiwan. And indeed, Taiwan technically has a claim to the Senkaku Islands as well. They're not much by themselves, but you can see that they're also right by the Okinawa prefecture of Japan. And they get visitors. Some of them are big, some of them, that's a Zodiac boat, gives you an idea of just how small these islands are. But the Chinese are always there. This is the list of Chinese government vessel intrusions into the Senkakus since 2008. And the red line are instances in which Chinese vessels come into the 12-mile territorial zone. The blue line is the number of vessels coming into the contiguous zone, 20 nautical miles out. And so the Chinese are constantly pushing. Even though there was a relative warming of Sino-Japanese relations between 2015 and 2018, when Abe Shinzo made his state visit there, Chinese vessels keep intruding. And so on the water, it doesn't look very friendly. Doesn't look very friendly in the air either. This is the air self-defense zone of Japan. They have lots of visitors as well, particularly down in the south, where you have H-6 Badger bombers coming through on a regular basis. So if you ask why Japan isn't all that hot on China, they have constant reminders that don't always make the news. You can also say that you know countries by their company, and this is the company that China keeps. And of course, Russia and Japan have a territorial dispute off of Hokkaido as well. So what have the Japanese been doing about this? Well, a number of things. And the first and foremost, they've changed a variety of the security legislation and constitutional interpretation, which I've already mentioned. They've increased their defense spending since 2013. They've joined the Quad and indeed are arguably the #1 advocate for the Quad. And they've made increasingly explicit statements of support for Japan. This is, okay, factionalism within, I switch this around. One of the things that used to keep Japan, in a sense, contingent about its relations with China from the 1970s really until 21st century was the factional split within the Liberal Democratic Party, which is the dominant party within Japan. And there were hawks and doves, as they called them, oftentimes split on a factional basis. And the Japan Liberal Democratic Party is a highly factionalized one. The Tanaka faction back in the 1970s, which still exists today as the Hosoda faction, famously dovish. Prime Minister Kishida's faction was known as a fairly dovish faction. The Nikkei faction, probably the most dovish, they're disappearing. not many doves left in Japan these days. And some of that is a generational effect. A lot of the doves in the LDP had been among the older Diet members at that time. And so that is a change. Other things that have changed, Prime Minister Kishida, again, his family comes from Hiroshima, and so there's kind of a history there about war and all that suffering there. But after he was elected as LDP president and then obviously prime minister, he has been notably hawkish on China. So this is the spending, and the brown bar is in US dollars. The gray bars are in yen. It doesn't look like much when you compare it to that Chinese line, but it is increased spending, and Japanese spending has increased by about 24% in yen terms since 2013. As I mentioned, they've been a big advocate of the Quad. Initially, it was called the Security Diamond. It had a very fancy Japanese name called Securite Diamondo. And so you all now speak Japanese in this case, but you can see who it is directed against. And indeed, Abe Shinzo was really the pusher of the Security Diamond idea. Kishida, of course, hosted the Quad leaders meeting in Tokyo at what is called the Nichibe Go-in Shunno Kaigo, which sounds better as Quad. Most Japanese newspapers just Quad, Latin letters there. But he was very much the host. It's interesting to note that in this picture, Modi is the senior member in this case. Everybody else is new for face-to-face Quad meetings at that time. There have been a number of statements that have come along which indicate that Japan is extremely concerned about what's happening in Taiwan. Aso Taro was prime minister in 2008. He's a leader of a major LDP faction, gave a speech in 2014 at an LDP function and said, if a big problem were to occur in Taiwan, it can be said that it would be an existential crisis. Then Japan and the United States must defend Taiwan. Now, there was some walk back and interpretations about the Japanese nature of the Japanese statement, but it was still pretty serious there. In 2021, the Ministry of Defense of Taiwan came out with a statement that basically announced that it had an interest in what goes on in the Taiwan Strait. And you don't have to go too far in saying that the Taiwan Strait ends with Taiwan. In that case. And so you have, these statements that keep coming in the Japanese official media. Prime Minister Kishi is the defense minister, is well known as a pro-Taiwan person. And indeed, I wouldn't say that Taiwan is purely an object in this. Tsai Ing-pei, the president there, knows how to cultivate Japanese lawmakers just as much as she knows how to cultivate others. And she has a Twitter feed with 1.4 million Japanese followers. When she announced her candidacy for the presidency, she did so in Japan, filling in the eye of a Daruma doll, which, that plays in Japan, doesn't play in Taiwan. So there are a number of people who have that. This is Kishi talking to his Chinese counterpart. The Chinese and the Japanese supposedly are setting up a hotline. Chinese haven't done anything about that. And of course, we have the various summits. In April 2021, the Suga-Biden summit said that we underscore the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and encourage the peaceful reunification of cross-Taiwan issue. This is the first time that in a joint statement between the US president and the Japanese prime minister where Taiwan had been entered since 1969. And so, and TV and Nikkei, TV Tokyo have done various polls, and Japanese, about 74% approved of that statement. And of course, we've talked a lot, everybody's talked a lot about Ukraine, and Japanese responded quite quickly on that with sanctions against Russia, sanctions on Russian oligarchs. They've made it quite clear that they're not going to prevaricate the way they did after Crimea. And Defense Minister Kishinobu said, if the international community somehow allows or condones Russia's aggression against Ukraine, it might send a wrong message that such actions can be tolerated in other parts of the world, including the Indo-Pacific. Ukraine may be East Asia tomorrow. How can Japan help? Well, what can I say in 45 seconds? It's got a number of things. It has increased its defense spending, logistics, rear area assistance. It can have a fairly active participation in kinds of conflict, but as everybody else has said, it's all about location, location, location. They sit astride the critical island chains, and they have a modern Navy and Air Force that would be possibly successful with American assistance in interdicting it. And they have made very substantial strides in recent years. They have actually more destroyers than the Chinese do. They have 4 things that they don't call aircraft carriers because that sounds offensive. They're helicopter destroyers. They're now testing them to make sure that they can work with F-35s. So that's where I will leave it and send it over to our colleagues across the Tsushima Strait.
Thank you very much, Steve, for your very interesting presentation on Japan's views on the question. We will continue with the perspective of South Korea with HJ's presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Justin, for inviting me to Montreal and have a presentation about the South Korea's perspective. It's first time for me to come to Montreal, so it's really exciting for me to be here. The question that I received from Justin when he invited me to come to this conference was, how has South Korea been handling China and the Taiwan question? So from there, I started to explore what happened and what the South Korea has been discussing about this issue mostly in the current literature, the existing literature. And I found out that there's really surprisingly lack of discussion in the South Korean scholarship regarding the Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait particularly. I mean, of course, there is a discussion about China-Taiwan relations, China-North Korea relations, China-Korea relations, but there is a lack of discussions about this Taiwan issue. So that actually gives me a topic for the next for my next research. So regarding these South Korea's perspective, I mean, in line with the first panel that talked about this possibility of war over the Taiwan, South Korea would not expect the war to happen over the Taiwan Strait, of course, and Korea doesn't want the war to happen. But having said that, I would like to talk about the reason why South Korea think of Taiwan Strait as a tricky issue for 2 reasons, the 2 factors. One is that the South Korea has never thought about this issue thoroughly. Frankly speaking, the South Korea's military capacity has focused on how to contain North Korea, how to contain the nuclear and conventional weapons, and increasing provocative activities, particularly the ballistic missile test and the nuclear test by North Korea. So the Korean military analysis and the military operation has been focused on the North Korea mostly. The regional issues are not unimportant to the Korean military. The maintaining peace and stability in the Asian region is significant, and it is mentioned in the National Defense White Paper. But, and it also pays attention to the changes of the regional settings, such as the increasing rivalry between the United States and China, and the Chinese military procurement, the Japanese military increase, or an increasing role in Japan in this region, the Russian increasing influence in this region, and etc. So they talk about this Korean military talk about these regional issues, but the possibility of war or crisis over Taiwan and how to deal with the crisis over Taiwan is rarely given a full consideration by the Korean military and the Ministry of Defense. It is interesting to note that the word of Taiwan has never been mentioned in the Korean National Defense White Paper. in the context of the US-China rivalry and the regional contingencies. And I think that it's really put this Korea position really contrasted with the Japanese position that Stephen Jackson just mentioned. Secondly, the issue of Taiwan is related with the entrapment problem for South Korea. As many people understand that there is alliance partners, they have experience entrapment fears and abandonment fears when they have disagreements on the issues. For South Korea, growing North Korea's provocation, increased precision of nuclear capability and ballistic missiles, South Korea feels insecure for the past several years, particularly, and it hopes to get enough commitments from the United States. And in order to get enough commitments from the United States, in order to confront North Korea, South Korea has been making an adjustment to the US strategy, providing alliance commitments to the United States. And this, in fact, creates a problem of entrapment for South Korea if the US gets involved in a war in other places other than the Korean Peninsula. The one example or two, the Iraq case and Afghanistan case, where South Korea sent non-combatant troops when the US needed help. And the reason why the United States, the reason why the South Korea sent this troop to this region, Iraq and Afghanistan, the South Korean government officials rationalize it in order to deal with the United States as a committed ally. And in the end, the main purpose is to confront the North Korean threats. So anything about the alliance task is deeply related with the South Korea's strategic concerns was about North Korea's threat. Taiwan is a similar case to South Korea. Korea has been extremely concerned about the possible war and the crisis over the Taiwan Strait, but the Republic of Korea does not perceive China as a major threat or major competitor, or not even a regional state. For the United States, it is. The United States believe that China is a major competitor, but not for South Korea. The reason is related with the South Korea's perception of China as an important partner that can communicate with North Korea. And perhaps China can bring North Korea into the discussion table so that South Korea has some connections with North Korea continued. So the process of providing commitments to the United States to maintain the alliance against North Korea, in fact, increases South Korea's entrapment fear and entrapment into the Taiwan crisis. Korea might get involved in the war if something happens, if the United States requests the South Korea to do so over the regional issues, even though the South Korea is not ready to take China as an enemy or a military threat. But if the United States requests South Korea to do so, it's gonna be a twisting the arms of Korea to get involved in the war. And this concern is related with what happened in 2005, where there was an agreement between the United States and Korea on a strategic flexibility of the US forces in Korea, USFK. In 2005 agreement, the United States was reorganizing this US grand strategy after the Iraq War. So there was a lot of changes happening, including the US forces in Korea, so that the US forces in Korea could be deployed to other regions more other than the Korean Peninsula, the flexible use of US forces in Korea to other regions, perhaps dealing with the regional issues, including Taiwan Strait. So, but in the end, Korea agreed with it. Korea agreed with the United States, but it was a big transformation for the South Korean perception to accept this agreement because USFK existed for Korean perspective, for the protection of the Korean Peninsula only. But this agreement changed the concept in the sense that the US forces in Korea could go beyond the Korean Peninsula and handle the regional contingencies like the Taiwan Strait. So what the United States, what the South Korea did in 2005 agreement on the issue of USFK, the flexible use of US forces in Korea, was that basically South Korea agreed with the United States strategy because of the South Korea needed the United States to protect it against the North Korean threat. But the South Korean government wanted to add a sentence that the Korea would never get involved in the regional problems without the Korean population's approval. And then the United States agreed with it, and the agreement was signed reflecting both the US concerns and South Korea's concerns. So the Republic of Korea agreed with the United States, but it created a condition for South Korea's participation on the regional issues. And it shows the Korea's concerns about being entrapped in an unwanted war, or a war that Korea is not ready to fight. For the past 17 years, since 2005 agreement, no one has mentioned on this issue in Korea. No one has questioned the Korea's intention by the United States, particularly whether Korea would get involved in the Taiwan Strait or not. So what Korea has been doing is pursuing a policy of ambiguity. We talked about the strategic ambiguity of the United States to deal with the Taiwan Strait, but for the Korea, also dealing with the United States on the one hand and China on the other side, it's pursuing a policy of ambiguity. In one sense, Korea agrees with the US grand strategy to protect South Korea against the North Korean threat. But in other sense, it also seeking that South Korea is not completely, is not going to be a reliable partner for the United States regarding this particular issue, the Taiwan issue. So because of this 2005 agreement with the United States, including the South Korea's condition that the South Korea would not get involved in a possible regional conflict without the South Korean population's approval, it might be, if something happens, if the crisis turns into a war, South Korea might be able to avoid the China's attack from the South Korea's perspective. But it also means that it might lose the US confidence in Korea and US trust in Korea as an ally. So in the long term, the South Korea's policy of ambiguity is untenable. As I said before, if push comes to shove, South Korea will probably provide the support for the United States and get involved in the crisis in Taiwan. But it's probable that the response from Korea would be extremely slow. Korea will wait and then get involved. So that means that the slow participation in the process of getting involved in a war in the Taiwan Strait. Moreover, even if South Korea gets involved in a war in the end, its participation is gonna be very limited because the major reason is related with what I mentioned as a first factor, North Korea. South Korea's military capacity cannot handle North Korea threat and then participation in Taiwan crisis in a full scale at the same time. So Korea's military should pay full attention to the North Korean threat, and the Taiwan Strait is gonna be the second priority. So if the crisis turns into the war in the Taiwan Strait, we can expect that the South Korea side will provide a slow and minimal participation. And I would like to talk about a few notable changes and events in what happened in recent days. As Stephen Jackson has mentioned, Japanese perspective, I will compare the South Korea's perspective with Japan more specifically. What happened in May 2021, there was a joint statement. I mean, there was a summit meeting between President Biden and President Moon, who was the previous president. The Biden-Moon joint statement included a very important change, which was that preserving peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And that was the first time ever that the Taiwan issue was mentioned in the ROK-US joint statement. And what happened in the past months, the mid-May 2022, President Biden and President Yoon, who is the new president in Korea, they also had a joint statement, and it also included the same contents. Importance of the preserving peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. But that was it. That's very simple. No additional comments other than that. But if you think about this, what Japan did, Japan started to address the Taiwan Strait problems as a major concerns for the Japanese security from at least 2005. the recent Japanese defense white paper talks about these, the sense of crisis emerging in the Taiwan Strait, and Japan perceived a threat from the Chinese factor. So we can see there's a subtle difference existed between South Korea and Japan in addressing this Taiwan issue. So the Korea, it wants to preserve the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait. In Japan, Taiwan is a major concern for the Japanese security. And South Korea's defense white paper, it hasn't mentioned Taiwan problem at all, but because the Korea defense white paper is published every 2 years, so it's coming this year. So we might be able to see some words on Taiwan, but we have to see. Secondly, related with this, when President Biden had a press conference with the Prime Minister Kishida in Japan in May 2022, President Biden answered to the question about this commitment of protecting Taiwan. Right? I mean, of course, there is the contents of this. It should be discussed a little bit further, but I would like to take the President Biden's comment from a situational perspective rather than a contextual perspective, which is that the U.S. president announced it, the confirmation of protecting Taiwan when he was with Japanese counterpart, not when he was with South Korean president. And I think it signals something important to the United States and China regarding how South Korea views the issue, how Japan handles this issue, and how the United States understands each ally, South Korea and Japan, feel about this issue of Taiwan. And for the additional comment, which is indirectly related with today's topic, is that Korean scholars, after the Yoon-Biden summit, they regarded the summit as successful, and they rated 8.6 out of 10. I don't know how they calculate it, but it's 8.6 out of 10, which is really, I mean, it's fairly good rating. So, and they argue that it is because it showed the strengthened US-Korea alliance moving toward next level, but at the same time, it didn't anger China. So, so that's something that I would like to add on, and I'd like to stop here. And microphone is going to.
Thank you very much, HJ, for this very clear presentation on South Korea's point of view and how different it is from Japan. I will now continue the discussion with John Blaxland on Australia's perspective.
Thank you, Justin. I might take the podium. I'm actually Anglo-Saxon, but I think I might have some Italian blood because I feel I need to use my arms.
Completely understand.
Thank you. Merci. C'est un grand plaisir pour moi de venir à Montréal de nouveau. Merci pour l'invitation, Justin. Thank you, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. I won't torture you with my shocking French any further. My wife complains about it. My wife is French, with French-Canadian background, and always criticizes my shocking accent, so pardonnez-moi de nouveau. And I have a few slides I want to share with you that will hopefully give you a sense of what our options are with a perspective from Australia, from down under. What you get with this map you're about to see, which you just saw a flash of, is a perspective of Australia. There it is, flashing again. Playing tricks on me. It's a map of Australia centered on Darwin in Northern Australia. It's an Air Force planning map, but it's spun 45 degrees to give you a sense of Australia hanging off Asia, but also the idea of it being part of the Indo-Pacific. And when you look at the map and you see on one side the Indian Ocean and on the other the Pacific, of course, the idea of the Indo-Pacific resonates compellingly from an Australian point of view. Merci.
It's okay.
Oui, c'est bon.
Perfect.
Ça marche. What I'm going to talk to you about is an Australian perspective, and it's informed by a work I've done on what I call a geostrategic SWOT analysis for Australia. That's the business concept of looking at your internal strengths and weaknesses and your external opportunities and threats. And when you look at that, there's a spectrum of challenges we face: economic, environmental, political, human, cyber, maritime, homeland, and territorial security. These are a range of issues. this is what Cleo was talking about in her presentation earlier as well. What I've tried to do is distill down this idea of my SWOT, and I won't bore you with that, but you can Google it and have a look at it if you're interested. But essentially, my wife actually challenged me. She said, John, I was drafting this and I thought I was being really clever, you know, with this SWOT. And she said, so what? I said, oh, dang. All right, you got me there. So what? And I thought, then okay, that then drove me to this, the Venn diagram. It's so what? What is the essence of what I was saying? What of the findings? And in essence, we face a range of challenges that are about great power contestation, looming environmental catastrophe, and a spectrum of governance challenges. And I was really have to echo what Claire was talking about this morning. The governance challenges and great power contestation, the mix of those is profound in Australia's neighbourhood, particularly in the Pacific. But then, of course, you throw in on top of that the fourth industrial revolution, and it's accelerating everything. Social media, computer, the way things are changing, it's just extraordinary, the rate at which things can happen and how far you can affect things from afar. And that's driving a significant change. Of course, China is Australia's largest trading partner. Despite the fact that Xi Jinping has imposed sanctions on Australia, they still buy more from us than they ever have before, okay? They've stopped buying our nice wine. It's more, actually, I'm now drinking way better Australian wine than I was because I can now afford better wine, but that's a minor issue. We're also, interestingly enough, equidistant to Canada. And this is a point I want to make. This is a finding from my book, Strategic Cousins, which with McGill Queen's University Press a few years ago, self-plug, sorry about that, folks. But essentially, you know, America's presence in the Pacific is enduring, but Canada is also equidistant to East Asian hotspots. And there are some significant geopolitical parallels here that are worthy, I think, for a Canadian audience to contemplate. And you think about this, firstly, Canada's military footprint in the Indo-Pacific in conflicts in the past is extensive. And most Canadians, I think, forget how extensive it's been. And this is actually your Indo-Pacific as well. And it's important to remember that. Of course, the other point I'd make here is that, and sorry about the flashing, but NATO, we talk about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Some say it was actually named that to keep the Latin Americans out and keep the Australians out, right? And to a certain extent, I think that's probably true. The NATO members actually are Indo-Pacific countries as well. The United States, and particularly France, and it was mentioned this morning as well, is a not inconsequential Indo-Pacific partner. In fact, the last conference I went to was in Paris, just as the lockdown was happening, for a conference on the Indo-Pacific, which was very interesting. And merci beaucoup pour l'invitation de nouveau. It was un grand plaisir. Moi, l'expérience dans l'hôtel, where I was in lockdown for 2 weeks. As I said, my French is shocking, so pardonnez-moi. But there is a real trade and security nexus here. And this, interestingly, the NATO-aligned countries are just flagged there for you. South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. The NATO visitors, we're seeing a really influx of NATO visitors lately. Germany, Netherlands, the UK. The UK, of course, is a five-power defence arrangement, partner nation as well, with extensive ties in the region with Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. Australia is also, has been a close partner with France, and hopefully with the new government able to recuperate that relationship because of our close collaboration with France, Australia, New Zealand, the FRANZ arrangement, and particularly the Quad du Sud linked activities in the South Pacific. And that's really important, particularly in light of what we've seen happening there lately. But one of the things, I did a Minerva research grant project that led to this book, US-Thai Alliance and Asian International Relations, my friend and colleague Greg Raymond, on US-Thai perceptions in Thailand of allies and of great powers. This graph shows you 2 countries, 1,800 respondents, 12 questions, China and the United States. United States influence has not gone away, but it's been eclipsed. And that is, this is the only mainland Southeast Asian treaty ally of the United States, eclipsed. And it's a very significant fact that needs to be borne in mind when we think about what's happening. We think about that, the competition and the political warfare that Claire talked about as well. Now, I want to touch on some of the things been happening in Australia. My colleague at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, Hugh White, he's been prolific on China. He's been prolific on basically talking us out of being too forthright in our support of the United States policies over China and particularly over Taiwan. And his most recent one is Sleepwalk to War, where he talks about an unthinking alliance with America. Now, Hugh is an outlier, I think. He is forthright. He's very interesting. His perspective is one that it does not go unchallenged, though. And I'm one of those who would challenge him, in part because it is an overly bleak view of Australia's position, of the United States position, and an overly optimistic view of China's ability, in my view. But it is a subjective view, and I recognise that. But there are others as well. The left's critique of the US alliance and calls for distancing. My friend Alan Beam has written "No enemies, no friends," calling for more of a neutral position. She was advisor to Penny Wong, no longer, the new foreign minister. And also a younger scholar, Emma Shortis, has got quite a lot of airplay over her book, Our Exceptional Friend, what she calls Australia's fatal alliance with the United States, painting a quite bleak picture, but you know, drawing on fairly realistic assessments of some aspects of the relationship with the United States that are problematic, that are important to address. So I flag these because this is a part of the reality, okay? And then the other side is, of course, defending the alliances. Books I've contributed to, well, the one on the left anyway, Australia's American Alliance, edited by friends and colleagues Dean Fruehling and Taylor, which talks about the breadth and depth of the ties, and Shannon Tao's book, Independent Ally, which plays on Coral Bell's former book, Dependent Ally, which playing up the fact that Australia has agency and we have a role. And that's a really important point. But one of the most significant roles is one people don't like talking about if you're in the know, because this is one Kick A facility, right? This is the Joint Defence Facility Pine Gap, Australia's major contribution to just about everything that goes off in the Indo-Pacific. Most people don't know much about it. Most people aren't allowed to know much about it, but it is phenomenal. It is extraordinary, okay? And it is the major contribution Australia makes 24/7 to security in the Indo-Pacific and to the alliance with the United States, and arguably to the fate of Taiwan. I can come back to that. Interestingly enough, our newly sworn in Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, literally moments after being sworn in by the Governor-General, we have a very similar parliamentary system in Australia to that in Canada, a federal bicameral Westminster-Washminster system, goes to Japan to validate AUKUS on first day on the job. And he has an appreciation for what's at stake. And I touch on here some of the things that Claire mentioned before. I won't dwell on it too much, but essentially there's a real appreciation. And the stats that Steve, you touched on before also speak on growing awareness in Australia that we are facing a set of challenges, the scale of which we have not quite appreciated until recently, covering psychological, media and legal warfare and other things. Now, Linda Jacobson she's in charge of an organisation called China Matters. It's been seen as a little bit soft on China. I actually think I defend it. I think it's a very important body, makes an important contribution to our understanding, has a number of China scholars and China practitioners involved who appreciate this. It talks about outright war over Taiwan being unlikely, and that China will use all means short of war, which reinforces the points that have been made earlier as well. And the Chinese pressure campaign to force unification negotiations will continue. No individual action by China would warrant a military response. So despite the $1 trillion US hammer, there's no nail for it to hit, which is a problem, right? Which is what we're seeing in the Pacific. We're seeing it all around the world, is just the failure to, it's been touched on by others as well, kind of to have a cohesive, coherent response to the tactics that are a mix of intimidation, disinformation, cyber attacks, that are hard for countries like Australia, the United States, and others, including Canada, to respond to. I wrote a piece in the conversation a little while ago saying China does not want war, at least not yet. It's playing the long game. And that resonates with some of the things that were being said earlier. But how long is that game? I think Steve might be onto something there. I don't think it's quite as long as some of the more optimistic people might think. And when you think about it, as a former intelligence analyst, what you do in the intelligence analysis business is weigh up the capability of the adversary and the likely intent. And when you look at that in the terms of Xi and his capability and intent, his declared intent is reunification with China by peaceful means, yet he builds the largest military in Asia, and it's clearly focused on Taiwan. And it's probably going to be ready by 2027 if Admiral Davidson is correct. And I think he's probably on the money, okay? But it is obviously, that's been sobered by the Ukraine experience. You know, and I take it there's been some debate about that this morning, and I appreciate that. And Charles, it was very interesting to get your perspective on that too. Thank you. My former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, now head of the Asia Society in Washington, DC, wrote this book, The Avoidable War, is touched on briefly. And he talked about geopolitical disaster is still avoidable, but only if the two countries, China and the United States, can find a way to coexist and to manage their strategic competition. But I would contend, I think my sense is he downplays the agency of the other actors. And this is kind of Hugh White's trap as well. It's a bit too binary. Hugh's as well, but it's just China and the US. And I'm thinking, no, look, there are too many other powerful actors, maybe middle powers, but when you aggregate the middle powers, they're not just middle powers, they're consequential powers. That's China, that's Korea, that's Australia. It's certainly India. And Canada as well. My colleague at the SDSC, another colleague, up and comer, who's got a new book with Cornell coming out this year. In fact, it's literally days away from coming out. Reliability and alliance interdependence. He makes a really interesting point that he challenges the idea of alliance orthodoxy, which people are afraid the United States feels it has to do something because of the demonstration effect. If they don't support Taiwan, that the others, Japan, Korea, Australia, are going to be afraid, and so they have to act. Now, I think he's got a point. It is an important point, but I think in the circumstances relating to Taiwan, there are extenuating circumstances, and they were touched on before, and I'll touch on them again as well now, and particularly relating to the prospects of war. China's capabilities is with diagrams the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington came out with just recently, published online, showing the military range and capabilities and the development of their military prowess as it affects the Taiwan Strait issue and the East China Sea and Taiwan in particular. And I won't dwell on that, but I want to drill on a little bit on the Taiwan parallels, particularly with Korea and then a couple of others as well. When Dean Acheson at the National Press Club in Washington in January 1950 talked about security in Asia, he basically dropped Korea and Taiwan, right? Now, it's very important which ones he dropped, Taiwan and Korea, okay? Now, 5 months later, President Truman had to eat his words because in a democracy, a president is elected by the people. And if you are going against the zeitgeist, if you are doing something that the people clearly are against, you will lose office. And the fall of Korea was just an outrage. It was seen as a gross violation that had to be stopped. And MacArthur was sent, and Australia and Canada and UK and France and others quickly followed. Australia just happened to be very quick because we had troops still in Japan after the Second World War, the occupation. But that UN Security Council resolution, as we know, was only made possible because the Russians walked out the first and last time. They don't walk out anymore. It led to the creation of the UN Command and the participation, this is an important point, of several NATO countries, okay? So this idea that NATO doesn't play in the Indo-Pacific, I'm sorry, folks, but when it comes to the crunch, it can, and it historically has done so, okay? The other examples I wanted to talk about, the parallels were weak demonstrations of US and allied resolve over Kuwait in 1990, when James Baker and his ambassador, particularly his ambassador in Baghdad, basically didn't send a strong enough signal, basically said, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. We don't really care what happens to Kuwait, okay? In fact, this is the problem. You play realpolitik. Realpolitik on its own is not enough when you're dealing with democracies, because we are not living in a Machiavellian world of dictators on all sides. You have, heads of state of democracies have to deal with their democracies. And if you do something that is considered outrageous, or that if somebody else does something that is considered outrageous, you have to deal with your electorate. And that's what happened in Kuwait, no question. Bush had to act, and he did. Similarly, over Ukraine in 2022, there were a lot of wishy-washy signals in early 22. And of course, we know what happened there. So I just make that point. So about the significance for the way things are portrayed, and why actually just go back a minute, why putting a strong message out about deterrence, maybe even maintaining strategic ambiguity, but not getting carried away with it, is so important. And we've touched on all these points before about the significance, but it is significant for Australia as well, for ASEAN, and Cleo touched on this, so she stole much of my thunder. It's just, she's too good. My friend and colleague Brendan Taylor, another colleague from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, wrote this book, The Four Flashpoints. And I draw your attention to this because in part, Taiwan's not the only flashpoint. And the remarks from this morning's session touched on that as well. And that is essentially, China is playing across the field. It's not just focused on Taiwan. And if we only focus on Taiwan, we will fumble the ball. We will miss the way the game should be played. Okay, it is a bigger, more complex, multifaceted challenge than that. Of course, the East China Sea is first, and it was touched on by Steve, thank you, on the Senkaku Jiayu challenge, and I won't dwell on that. Then there's, of course, the South China Sea, and the so-called 9-dash line, the red line pictured on the bottom right there, 9 dashes, which completely contravenes the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which clearly, and Cleo was touching on this morning about the Chinese desire to overturn it and working on overturning it effectively. The PLA presence in the South China Sea does provide some restrictive options for defence of Taiwan, because that does mean anything coming from Europe or from India or from Australia is going to face potential obstacles in that space militarily, should that ever transpire. Similarly, we've got I talk about Southeast Asia being a proto-great power. When you aggregate Southeast Asia, we tend to do that. We disaggregate it, right? We don't think of it as a proto-great power, but it's 650 million people, $2.5 trillion economy. It's Australia's third largest trading partner. It's consequential. And it's also what Joko Widodo, the Indonesian president, called the maritime fulcrum of the Indo-Pacific. Now, he hasn't played on that very much, but when you think about the geography, it's the gateway between India and the Pacific, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. It's consequential, but it is so messed up. They talk about unity in diversity. It's an aspirational term because it is not united. It's far from united for a host of reasons, and they're listed there. It's a very diverse community, but it's a very interesting one. Now, Korean War redux. I edited a book on Australia's involvement in the Korean War. There is a fear of that. Obviously, that's not inconsequential. And responding to North Korean threats is ongoing. The Canadian Navy is there, the Australian Navy is there, US Navy, I think France and the UK are involved as well, and other countries. Very interesting with President Yoon coming to office and the reinvigoration of the US-ROK alliance, the prospect of more third high altitude air defense systems, or THAADs, and the prospect of enhanced regional security cooperation. President Moon, his predecessor, had a look south policy, which went further south to Australia. And it's been very interesting to see that pursued. And we'll see how President Yoon takes that, if he takes that any further. But there are prospects of that getting further as well. This is just to reinforce, my thunder was stolen again by Cleo. God help me, but essentially, the Pacific is not just a bunch of tiny irrelevant specks in the ocean. They're incredibly consequential, which is why China's after them, not just because of the strategic significance, but because of the economic significance. The economics is integral to the strategy. The fishery stocks, if you think about it, you know, China's exclusive economic zone is tiny, minuscule, up here, in a tiny strip for a country of 1.4 billion, tiny compared to these microstates out here with massive exclusive economic zones. No wonder China's playing in that space. I completely get why they'd want to do that, okay? It makes economic sense. It makes strategic sense as well. But doesn't mean we should just lie down and think of England taking it, right? Pardon me for my British colleague here. Very interesting, the Penny Wong visit and the Wang Yi visit happening pretty much at the same time. There's a, you know, the jury's still out on how the efficacy of those visits, but it is extensive. And we saw that touched on before. I won't dwell on it further. Very interesting from an Australia's response to China's economic pressure. And this, I think, is significant when you think about Taiwan as well, because China's imposed sanctions on us for daring to challenge them on things that really are mostly about our own prerogatives, about what happens inside Australia, you know, about our policy decisions that they've taken offence to. Over beef, barley, coal, wine, etc. They've imposed all these sanctions. But you know what? The global market is not a command economy. It's not Mao's China. It's not Xi's China either. You pull one lever and other ones get released. You know, there's supply, there's demand, there's floods, there's famines, there's feast, there's good times, there's bad times. There's fluctuations that no one entity owns, no one entity controls. So our trade has actually grown. We now have a greater trade relationship with China than we had even before the sanctions. It's crazy. They're buying more from us than ever. We have a range of other free trade agreements. We've been diversified, which are actually, when you think about a Taiwan crisis, all the more important for how you manage the response. And I'm sure China is thinking about these too, okay? How to possibly mitigate the risks and the effects of these relationships. I would make a point just also about the fear of the consequence of the relationship with China being damaged. The United Kingdom, ironically enough, you know, 50 years ago, it joined the European Economic Community, the precursor to the EU, and abandoned Australia and New Zealand economically. We lost our trade benefits, and New Zealand suffered much more than Australia. But Australia suffered. We went through quite a significant downturn economically. Just so happened to be when Gough Whitlam was Prime Minister, a liberal, you know, Labor Party, but a small L liberal reformer. He got caught up in that period. But Australia today is actually much more prosperous, much more, I wouldn't want to go back to Australia of 1973, okay? So this idea that, oh, well, you know, we are all beholden to China's economic generosity in buying from us is, I think, misleading and unhelpful. I would also make a point that there's competition over Antarctica. Most Australians forget that we actually claim 40% of this. I would contend that partner nations of Australia should be looking to support Australia's position on this, because you know who else is going to get it if we don't? It's another great power, okay? Who's active in this space, really active in this space, okay? We have, yeah, I won't dwell on that. There we have it. So I would just put the point here about competition. Claire talked about the various types of warfare. Another way of describing it is in terms of a competition prism. And I think these are all things that are happening right now. And they're happening around Taiwan, and they're happening around the South China Sea, they're happening in the South Pacific, and they're happening over Korea, the Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands, and so on, okay? This is ongoing. Now, in terms of the ADF's, the Australian Defence Force's capacity to respond to any crisis in Taiwan, well, we have a boutique defence force, I'm sorry to say. It's really good. It's really honed. It's high-tech, professional, sharp as a tack. But it's a one-punch force, okay? It's designed for the unipolar moment. We were only really designed to help the United States, and they didn't really need us. They just wanted us to help. And we've helped in Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, and Iraq. You didn't really need us, but, you know, it was nice to be asked, right? Anyway, that moment's gone. We're now back in an era more like what we had back in the Second World War or in the lead up to the Second World War. Now, we have a 1 or 2 division army. You know, division has about 10,000 troops in it, a dozen or so warships, a handful of submarines, and about 100 fighters, plus support aircraft, you know, the ones that enable the 100 fighters to do their business. At the height of the Second World War, January 1943, we had an army of 14 divisions out of a population 1/3 of what it is today. We had 8 million then, 26 now. We had 14 divisions in January 1943, okay? So it's a bit like Canada, very similar to Canada in that respect. So when we think about what the challenge might be in the future, we need to be thinking about muscling up, for crying out loud. We need to seriously think about muscling up, okay? And we're talking about, oh, we're bolstering the defence force. We're talking about 18,000 new troops in the next 18 years. That's nothing. That's really very small fry. Now, we are doing some stuff on the cyber domain, and this is big because this is a big competitive space. A lot of contestation happening in this space. There's a lot of work being done there. $8 billion being thrown at the Australian, or 10, nearly 10, the Australian Signals Directorate, the RAS-NSA or CSE equivalent, on this thing called Red Spice, talking about resilience, effects, defence, space, intelligence, cyber, and enablers. Lots of great work. Echoing the foreign policy white paper of 2017, what I call Australia's foreign policy plan B, which was written shortly after Trump came to office. We think, OMG, what do we do now? What do we do when the United States become less certain, when our reliance on them becomes less reliable, it appears? Well, you then start stressing everything else, the Indo-Pacific. You talk about, yes, you keep your engagement with the United States, you double it down on the Quad, the ASEAN relationship, the Pacific Step Up, bolstering regional economic and trade ties and so on. They're all things that are ongoing and that are related also to the prospects of Taiwan. The Quad, very interestingly enough, you know, and Sana may well speak to this later, but I just draw your attention. India is not just a consequential power because of the land border. India also controls the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which are the gateway to the Malacca, which is the jugular vein of trade to Northeast Asia, particularly China. And from Australia's point of view, of course, we control Cocos and Christmas Islands, which are also the gateway to the Lombok and the Indonesian Straits, the Wetar and Sunda Straits. But the Quad, very significant, but there's need to do a lot more in that space. And thankfully, Kishore Mahbubani's picked up on this about the economics being the big game, and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is a partial answer to that. And I think only a partial answer. We need to go a lot further because, you know, as Bill Clinton once said, and I think I could probably, you know, misquote him here in saying it's the Indo-Pacific economy, stupid. That's the game, you know, and we need to think about that. And we've been building up our defence capability. We're talking about to shape, deter and respond, talking about the grey zone, about joint industry. We talk the talk, we're not walking the walk enough. It's not enough. It's considerably more than Canada is, to be fair, though. We're being much more forward-leaning than Canada, but it is still not enough, I would contend. AUKUS is a big part of the deal. You can see there a diagram indicating the range, the additional range and endurance of nuclear propulsion submarines for Australia. Now, how we handled it, I think, is just atrocious. Je suis complètement désolé about what's happened with France. I think and I'm really hoping that the new government can reset our relationship with France. But this nuclear propulsion idea, I don't know why we didn't do it with the French option, but anyway, we didn't. And we are where we are. And it is significant, though, and I think we need to make this happen as quickly as possible. And there are some benefits, obviously. It's quieter, faster, more survivable, and with longer endurance, can stay on station for longer and get there quickly. And of course, when you think about it, all those straits that you see lines to are all ones that China depends on for trade. So when you think about a Taiwan Strait crisis, You can't think about it without thinking about the knock-on economic consequences and on its standing economically and geostrategically. All right. I've taken too long, but when I put for Australia, the context is there's a range of plausible concurrent Defence Force support requirements. Okay, Taiwan is one of them. It's not officially part of the lingo, but increasingly it's part of the debate and a part of the policy discussion in Canberra. Okay, but it is one of many challenges that we are contemplating on addressing with a boutique Defence Force. And for Canada, and I contributed in writing this paper a few years ago, Facing West, Facing North with Aspie and CG, Australia and Canada are both modest-sized players in a big region. But if we learn to pool our resources in the various ways suggested in that paper, we can achieve some valuable outcomes. And I would contend that as strategic cousins, Canada and Australia, these middle powers have some important relationships in the region, and the ones I've touched on in the Indo-Pacific are very similar to the relationships Canada has in the Indo-Pacific as well, perhaps more beefed up on Australia's case. But there's a facsimile there, there's a parallel there that I think is useful for Canada to reflect on, to think about its policy options into the future. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Merci, John. Thank you, John, for this lengthy but interesting presentation. We still have about less than about 50 minutes for discussion with the audience online. I ask you to ask your questions through the Q&A function if you're online watching us, the Zoom function. But I will also abuse my power as the chair to launch a first round of questions. It is the only power, except cutting your microphones. But it used to be easily, it's easier to be done online than in person. First question, that's actually two, because both you, John, and Steve, you had a more pessimistic, I would say, understanding of the likelihood of a war over Taiwan, but you did not necessarily explain why you had that perception compared to the presentations we had this morning. So first of all, I would like you to expand on this and why you think it's more likely to happen sooner than later. And the second more profound question, I would say, I would like you to link the country you've worked on's perspective in its relationship with the U.S. Deterrence strategy. So I'm thinking about HJ, you said, you know, South Korea may be reluctant, but will take part in what would be called the deterrence by punishment strategy in case there was a military conflict over Taiwan. But what about the other types of deterrence strategies? And I'm thinking, of course, of deterrence by denial. What is your country's perspective on this? What does it do to prevent a war from happening, not just responding in case of it? And second, in this elusive concept that's being discussed in Washington of integrated deterrence, is that part of the discussion in South Korea, Japan, and Australia shaping these countries' strategy towards China and the US? Thanks. Let's start with Steve.
All right, thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't have time to talk about why I'm a pessimist. And ironically, many of the things that were said about China and its statecraft this morning, I think could be turned around and said that China, for instance, I like John's phrase, has plateaued. But that means that time is working against China. And that's one of the scariest parts of any crisis, is when you think that time is working against you, you're much more likely to reach extreme mechanisms. And I think that's a problem. Secondly, it's a political decision. And assuming that Xi Jinping is reelected as party general secretary or maybe even chair this fall, that's a violation of norms. And the only reason why he can justify this violation of norms is he's going to do something great. Well, he hasn't done great things for the economy right now, and that's largely because he hasn't done great things about COVID right now. So he's running out of great things to do. Taiwan would be the great thing. To talk about that is to say, okay, Xi Jinping, you've had another 5 years. Have you produced Taiwan yet? Now, do I think the Chinese are going to try economic mechanisms and positive enticements? I think they shot their bolt on positive enticements in Hong Kong. The idea that there's going to be some sort of viable one party, two system, one country, two systems. There's one party and there's going to be one system. And so enticements aren't all that great anymore, at least as far as Taiwan is concerned. And I think the DPP is going to be reelected. And that means that, time is working against China. And so, a variety of things make me think that Xi Jinping wants to get this done before he comes up for his 4th term in office, and he can say, here, I brought you Taiwan. And he really doesn't care that much about the cost. The really scary conclusion I come to is that he may not be deterrable short of nuclear weapons. That, he is absolutely determined he is going to do something great for the Chinese nation, that his name will be up there with Mao Zedong. And the only thing that he can still do is get Taiwan. And he's going to try economic means, but I think as John and some others have pointed out, the Chinese record on economic statecraft as a coercive tool is a mixed one. Murray Scott Tanner wrote a book in 2007, Rand, about that, and he said it's mixed. And several people have also written about this, and there's only so much twist that they can do. And if you look at, for instance, Australia, it's a great example. They were going to bring Australia to their knees. How's that working for them? Not so well, quite frankly. And so what do you have left? You have military force. And my greatest fear vis-a-vis Japan's participation is that it's going to be a scenario which is just this side of open combat, to make Japan and other US allies say, I'm not sure about this. And what my nightmare is a quarantine. Don't call it a blockade. And where would they have learned that term? From the Americans in 1962. That they're going to try to blockade Taiwan. And with 48 frigates now in building, that's the kind of force that you would do that. And so they're going to be outside of all of those harbors, daring us to fire the first shot and us being the bad guys in those situations. So those are kind of the ideas that I had about that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So the pessimism issue and the sooner than later, I think it comes down to some of the things Cleo was talking about as well. You think about what's just happened in the Solomon Islands. We were, completely played. Australia's been the hugest benefactor of Solomon Islands. We are by far the biggest engager with the Solomon Islands. And then the Chinese come in and completely undercut us through brown paper bags. And we just don't play that game, so we get beaten. And now that's arguably it's a temporary thing. Arguably we can recover from that. But my sense is that you translate that into a Taiwan Strait scenario. This is not about an invasion. This is about playing all sorts of other games that don't involve, they involve threatening the use of military force and perhaps huffing and puffing and playing and suggesting you're going to, but actually doing something quite different and making, as Steve just said, make you look like the bad guy, make you look like you're the aggressor. You're the one who's actually generating the problem. You're the one who's starting a war that really should have been solved peacefully if we'd only been more accommodating. So, you talk about the quarantine. I think the better parallel is what happened to Japan in 1940-41 when it had oil sanctions imposed by the United States. I suspect that's probably, in reverse. That's something that China can do. It certainly is worrying to think about this. Integrated deterrence. We are becoming more integrated. The Defence Strategic Update, the Foreign Policy White Paper. I think we will see from the new Australian government some kind of national security strategy emerge in the next 6 to 12 months that will try and put a more holistic frame on foreign defence and national security policy writ large. We had a national security strategy written a bit over a decade ago, but it was when there was a more benign view of the world and where China was not seen in such adversarial terms. So I think we're going to see more of that. Thanks.
Thank you.
In terms of the deterrence possibility, I mean, I would like to say that there is increasing discussion between the United States and Korea in terms of extended deterrence, and particularly the the President Yoon and President Biden had a summit meeting, and they talked a lot about this extended deterrence. So the strategic deployment of the U.S. forces in terms of in line with this extended deterrence to confront these, deal with the North Korea's nuclear capability. But at the same time, the deterrence can be applied from the from the North Korea's perspective toward the United States, and particularly, so the deterrence can work right now is work in a two-way direction, I guess, right now. And particularly after this Ukrainian crisis, North Korea learned the lesson from the Ukraine crisis that the North Korea has to have the nuclear capability and develop the nuclear capability further along with the ballistic missiles. The question is if North Korea really has deterrence capability vis-a-vis the US attack. It is still questionable because they're working on these ballistic missiles. But for the short-range ballistic missiles that can target South Korea, that of course North Korea has capability and precision is increasing. So it's gonna, if we, wait longer in terms of the North Korea's nuclear capability, they're gonna keep testing missiles and ballistic missiles and submarine ballistic missiles they're testing. So the deterrence capability of the North Korea is gonna be increasing. So I would like to highlight that.
Thank you very much. I'll now take questions from the room or online. If anyone wants to start. Just identify yourself before asking a question, please. Massie. You.
Thank you for this great panel, Jonathan Paquin. I guess this question is for all of you. You talked about the Quad, which of course includes Australia and Japan, and you also alluded to other regional organizations in the Indo-Pacific. But the fact of the matter is that there is no multilateral organization similar to NATO in the Indo-Pacific. You got, of course, the hub and spoke, which is a web of bilateral relationship between Washington and some of the states in the region, but nothing else. So in the case where China would invade Taiwan, it would be arguably harder to coordinate a common response to China. And so knowing that, my question, I guess, is, could you tell us more about the defense and intelligence cooperation and coordination between the three countries that you talked about this afternoon, so Australia, South Korea, and Japan? To which extent are they sharing a lot of information? To which extent do they have similar positions? So if you could flesh out a little bit on this, it would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Steve, would you like to go first?
You're right that there isn't a NATO in Southeast Asia, despite American attempts in the 50s and 60s to create those organizations. And frankly, one of the key factors that makes it very difficult is that our two most important allies in the region, South Korea and Japan, don't get along. And that's, has been, I don't see it as a solvable problem. It may be ameliorated, but I don't know it's solvable. Australia, on the other hand, I think you now, thanks to the Quad and also RIMPAC, which just got started yesterday, is putting more interoperability between Australia and Japan. But it's the U.S.-Japan relationship that is going to be about 90% of operations again to defend Taiwan, and there we have outstanding interoperability. We drill together, we do scenarios together, and the possibilities for Australia contributing. There are a variety of kind of military diplomatic moves that you could have together in informal settings. If it's a short war in Taiwan, then I'm not sure the Australians will be there in time, even with nuclear submarines. And I don't think they're going to have their nuclear submarines in 5 years. That's just my guess there. Longer term, yeah, John is right in that Australia has, in a sense, interdiction on the key straits going into the South China Sea. And the Chinese have been obsessed with the Malacca dilemma, and they still haven't solved it. I mean, they've ameliorated it by, Russian pipelines, and they talk about a pipeline through Pakistan. There's no way that's going to happen. So there is a long-term contribution that Australia could make, and that may not necessarily come to a war. I mean, if Australian nuclear submarines 10 years from now can stop the oil from flowing to China, then it might make China think twice about doing something. But we will see. My scenario is either the blitzkrieg strike against Taiwan, and then there are the two variants, only Taiwan, and so do you help, or they strike against U.S. and Japanese forces and just settle it all at once scenario. I don't think they're going to do that because it makes China the bad guy. But the advantage of doing that is that you're rolling the iron dice. Of course, Germany did that in 1914 too.
Okay, I have like 2 points to make. One is the bilateral cooperation, and the second one is multilateral cooperation. So in terms of sharing information and intelligence, as Stephen mentioned, it's in terms of bilateral cooperation between Korea and Japan has been really problematic, as we have seen the cases of GSOMIA, which is General Security of Military Information Agreement, that requires South Korea and Japan share the information intelligence related with the North Korea threat and other security issues. The United States pushed this agreement move forward, and the South Korea and Japan could coordinate with each other in the past several years, but it didn't work out. The South Korea wanted to, the Korean government and Korean leaders, they wanted to pass this to GSOMIA and have it worked out. But then there is a strong nationalist movement against this because they didn't like Japan a lot. So when they believe that the sharing information with Japan would be detrimental to the South Korean security, which is not true. So because of internal problem in South Korea, it has been really difficult to have cooperation with Japan, and particularly in security issue. There's a lack of participation in the multilateral cooperation from the South Korea side, but of course there's increasing one. The RIMPAC, the South Korea is participating really vigorously, but in terms of for the past several years under the Moon government, the previous leader, even the US and South Korea didn't have a lot of military exercises. And then that also impacted the South Korea's participation in the multilateral, exchanges, the multilateral, the military exercises with other regional powers. But of course, that does not necessarily mean that South Korea doesn't emphasize the importance of cooperation and coordination with Australia, Japan, and other countries. But under this Yoon administration, the new administration, the military exercises and then the exchanges of the information is going to be highlighted. So we're going to see some positive side of changes from the South Korea, and I really hope so.
Yeah, I would just add, and I'm sorry, I asked HJ to go first before me, and I really wanted to hear what you had to say, to be honest, but also it kind of gels with what I was thinking as well about Australia-Korea relations and Australia-Japan relations and trilaterally. They're all spokes from the hub, from the Cold War alliance metaphor, but increasingly there's been connections between the spokes. In the last few years, post-Cold War, it kind of died off because no one felt the need. We all had the kumbaya moment. We're all, holding hands, and the end of history was happening. It was not. We don't need armed force anymore. Those days are past us. It appears, and there's a recognition in all those countries, Australia, Korea, and Japan, I would contend, that there is a need for collaboration and cooperation more so than ever. And we're seeing that in Canberra. We're seeing lots of visitors from Korea and Japan, on delegations coming to talk about improving bilateral ties. But look, to be honest, in large part because of the fact we're US treaty allies, we've got standardization agreements that echo NATO arrangements. We have a lot of points of commonality already. We have a lot of issues. I used to be the J2, the Chief of Joint Intelligence Operations at our Joint Operations Command, and I had oversight of our thing called the JCDX, Joint Commanders Domain Exchange or something. It was a situational awareness picture, right? Whiz-bang computer, right? Whiz-bang computer that integrated all these sensors. When I went to this conference in DC, and there was the Korean delegation and the Japanese delegation, both in different corners, right? Going to the same conference because we shared the same system. We operated the same system. Korea and Japan didn't share the data. So, but it was a switch. It's just a policy issue. There's an amazing amount of commonality already that exists that if you need to, pretty much on a dime, you can turn on between them. And let's face it, all of the all the players are all English speakers, or they have a very competent LO, liaison officer, who's a fluent English speaker. One of my PhD students is a Korean Navy guy who's a very impressive young man, who's one of these classic examples of one of these people who are a product of this system that are could be from Japan, could be from Korea. He happens to be from Korea, and so my sense is, and now as a former Intel guy, I can tell you this. From an Australian point of view, there's a lot of exchange, a lot of swapping of notes. There's a degree of guardedness there because there are policy issues, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that in Australia's case, and same with Japan and Korea, to be honest, they've got intelligence sharing relationships with the United States, and therefore they've got to be careful about not crossing boundaries beyond what they're allowed to share. But essentially, there's a lot that can be shared, and that is shared between them. Hopefully that helps.
I think Teresa, you had a question. Can you give her the mic? Just a second. Wait for the mic.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for excellent panel. I mean, the second excellent panel. And I would have a sort of a follow-up question for Hyon too, if I may. I liked your characterization that, if South Korea joins any actions, if war in Taiwan breaks out, that is going to be slow and very limited, because I think this is what we have actually seen in South Korea's reaction to the war in Ukraine, or at least this is the European perception of South Korea's reaction. But my question is slightly different, and following up on the question on sort of Asian NATO, there's been lots of discussion about President Hyon joining the Quad, or at least unofficially, Quad becoming Quad Plus with South Korea. Of course, there was the best chance for that to happen just recently, and it didn't. What do you think? What's happening in this area? But if you think about reactions to potential war in Taiwan, it's not just the military reaction, but also all the sanctions. So how do you see that South Korea would potentially, go ahead with sanctions against China if you think about the South Korean experience about that in the past, but in general, not just a military reaction, but possibly economic or other types of reactions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a tough question. Well, I would say this. I want to talk about this in terms of economic arena, and of course, South Korea relies on China a lot, and almost 20% of South Korea's trade is with China. China is the #1 trading partner. So, whenever people talk about the U.S. and China relations, Korea's relations with the U.S., Korea's relations with China. The U.S. is needed for the security guarantee, and China is needed for South Korea's economic strategic partner. But if you think about this, what happened in 2017 when the South Korean government deployed a THAAD system in the Korean Peninsula. Of course, it is for the U.S. forces, not for the South Korea, but the U.S. forces in targeting North Korea. China implemented economic sanctions against the South Korea. That's not official, but unofficially imposed economic sanctions, and particularly the Lotte, the company that provided the area for the U.S. The THAAD system. The Lotte that was operating in the China and this market, the grocery market that Lotte was operating in China is completely locked. It's completely gone out. And then this, the cosmetic companies in Korea, in China got a harm because of this economic sanction. And also the travel ban from the Chinese government vis-a-vis the Chinese people going to South Korea. And all these things happened, and this changed the whole perception of South Korean people toward China for the past several years. And as Stephen mentioned, it's shown the perception, the positive rate of, public opinion poll about the China, and you can see the drastic change since then. Related with the possibility of South Korea's imposing economic sanctions against China, again, this is really difficult to say, but they are thinking about this, how they were treated by Chinese. They are not extremely happy. They're meaning Korean people are not extremely happy about how China treated Korea when China had a power. But at the same time, it doesn't want to lose the economic market. So I'm not quite sure if South Korea can, willingly join these economic sanctions against China. And I think it's related with other countries too. Japan, I don't know. I'm not sure if Japan is willing to impose economic sanctions against China. Of course, Japan also got the economic sanctions when the Japanese government purchased the Senkaku Island, right? And they had a serious problem. But even so, this economic interaction is still ongoing. So it is really difficult to say that it's going to be absolutely participation in economic sanctions against China if something happens.
Thank you. I'll take two questions because there's a lot on the floor. So Derek first, and then I'll take Charlie's question.
Yeah, just following up on that point with President Yoon, I find it fascinating because I can't remember a South Korean president ever being so international in his or her perspective as Yoon is. Yoon has talked about cooperating more with like-minded democratic partners throughout the Indo-Pacific on a variety of issues. In fact, I don't think any leader of South Korea has ever said those things. They've always been focused on North Korea, as you said in your presentation, and maybe secondarily a bit on Japan and China. So I wonder, what is prompting Yoon to be so kind of broad thinking in his perspective about the region, and how might that play out in a China-Taiwan scenario? Because you're right, he mentioned Taiwan in the readout last month with Biden, but there was very little said. Might we expect more in the future?
And Charlie.
Justin, you might want to ask me to be quiet because not so much a question as comment. Well, yeah. So the first comment is on the first island chain, and then importance of Taiwan in it. I don't think any of us have really necessarily said that, but is it not right that the Americans simply cannot afford Taiwan to be lost, because otherwise you have to give up the Western Pacific if you simply look at the topography of it. I also find it, and therefore I think it would challenge China if China started to implement blockades or whatever. Although I find it very odd that we talk about war between China and America, knowing that they're both nuclear powers and where that might lead, which we would never talk about in a Russian context. The same thing, because we've moved way sometimes in the past away from Taiwan, but linked Taiwan to the South Pacific, and the importance of that is, what exactly is China's aims? Could someone actually lay those out? I mean, I can see that you wish to detach certain countries from diplomatic relations to Taiwan. You want votes in the UN, and there are countries down there that you're getting. There's a tendency for empires to grow and accrete, and you build ports, etc. I'm a little bit doubtful about the fishery stocks argument, merely because you don't need ports, and that you can have these motherships and you can take the fish from the Falkland Islands or wherever you like without having a base anywhere near. But yeah, why are they so specifically going down there?
Thank you. I can't really comment about Hyon, but I will go to your comment. I'm actually writing a book called China's Waters that involves things like fish. And China is very interested in fishing in places that don't have fishing fleets of their own, and they're more than happy to help you out with that by fishing up all your fish and then giving you a cut of the cash. And that's, something that they want. And it won't cost them very much. The Chinese think that that will benefit that country. I don't think it would, but that's it. The second thing that the Pacific EEZ zone map keeps driving home to me is China, I think, would like to renegotiate UNCLOS such that EEZs are much more like territorial waters. And it is, when you think about its role, all those Pacific countries, very low population, poor countries, China could spend a lot of money and have these agreements with them that effectively territorialize much of the South Pacific and thereby completely isolate Australia, which could, be just as difficult as, the close-in waters in those cases. And so I think that those are a couple of things. I also think that they know that if they're going to change UNCLOS, they need a lot more votes in the UN. And this may be one of the ways that they're going to get it, as well as nobody's mentioned Africa. But that's where a lot of Belt and Road Initiative is going. And the great thing about, small, poor countries is a little bit of economic barrier goes a long ways. In those cases. And so, if they want to renegotiate the way in which water is owned, then that's one part of their strategy. The other part of the strategy is this, community of common destiny, which is, I like to call it China's policy of what's mine is mine, but what's yours is ours. In which, everybody gets to share it, and that would be another strategy for that same approach.
Yeah, thanks. I would just add, I think, maybe it's a little bit not quite right to see the industrial fishing vessels as the answer, the long-term answer. I think, Steve, you're probably right about the deals, being able to do this on a more legitimate basis, on a basis that's recognised by the national governments of the exclusive economic zones who you're imposing yourself upon is significant. But I would add also, and look, I don't think we can play down the significance of fish protein. It's really consequential. It really is a big deal. It's a major factor in the South China Sea, I would contend. It's also not much left now because it's been rapaciously stripped. But it's also an issue of seabed resources. and this is something that's becoming increasingly possible with technology nowadays, to exploit the seabed resources of the exclusive economic zones, which China's been looking to do more extensively in the South China Sea, at the expense of the other EEZ holders of Southeast Asia. But there's potentially enormous opportunities. And as China looks into the future, they're thinking economically as well. And I think, you know, we've tended to focus on the geostrategic dimensions here. China is thinking as an empire. You are right to go there, Charles, because, you know, I actually think one model I talk to my students about is the British Empire. When it expanded, when Sir Francis Drake was, you know, floating around, he didn't have a manifesto to conquer the world. It happened incrementally. It happened with the Industrial Revolution and with the demand for markets and supplies and materials. And you needed to secure your markets, and you needed to secure your mines and your sources of rubber and coal and all the spices and things you needed for the empire and for the industry to grow and work. So there's a certain internal rationale economically for this to happen. And that involves doing deals in the South Pacific that are in its interests, that have an economic dimension, not just a strategic military dimension. So they're overlapping. You can't just say it's one or the other. That's why my Venn diagram of the overlapping areas, it's not just geopolitics. It's not just the environment, and it's not just problems of governance. It's all of them mixed in. And, you know, Claire talked on this before, the comprehensive national power. Yeah, thanks. This is something we in Australia and Western democracies have not been thinking about. We have got a disaggregated view of power, and it's part of the shambolic nature of democracies. You know, we just kind of don't think of it as a comprehensive national entity. We're not that way inclined. And I think this is making us think more that way. Just also on Russia versus China as nuclear powers, I'll just make a point. China has never been seen in the same way as Russia has. China has never been seen as an equal, as a peer in terms of nuclear power. It's only recently had, you know, developed the second strike capability to deter, and it certainly has never had a credible, realistic first strike capability that was, you know, seriously a threat. And Russia has for generations. Now, China is changing that equation, as we saw in the brief that I think Claire talked about. The equation's changing significantly, and that, I think, is going to increasingly change into the future. So how we look at China and how we face this is increasingly going to change. But I would contend this also reinforces why the prospect of a conventional war that we've traditionally, you know, a World War II type scenario, becomes increasingly less plausible. There are so many other things short of that kind of kinetic confrontation that are more plausible and more likely and going to be more problematic, because we don't have the hammer to hit that nail. We're just not equipped for it. We don't have a brown paper bag strategy. We're being played.
Regarding the Yoon, President Yoon, thank you so much for the question, because I haven't thought about it, but your question pushed me to think about the reason why. And I was thinking about two reasons. One is related with the structural reasons, which is Chinese increasing assertive posture towards South Korea. If you look at the military side, I mean, there is interactions between China and South Korea, but for the past several years, Chinese actions were not based on the rule, international rule. The China interrupted the Korean air defense zone several times, and more than that, and without notice. And the Chinese naval force also entered into the Korean side of the EEZ. In case of 2020, it was almost like 220 times. Before that, it was 310 times. And the government at that moment didn't emphasize or didn't say anything about it. And of course, the newspapers and talk about it. And people fed up with the South Korean government's sort of calmness, too calm about this Chinese increasing assertive actions towards South Korea. And of course, there is increasing, I mean, sort of the Chinese, I don't know if you remember this, but in the Beijing Olympic games. What is it? It is Winter Olympic Games, right? So there was the group of people that represent the Chinese minority groups. And then one of the minority was wearing Korean traditional clothes. And China it represents that China think of the Korean culture. I mean, it's Korean traditional clothes actually. And Korean culture is a part of the Chinese. And that somehow angered Korean a lot. And then still then, under this previous administration, they didn't say a lot about it. They didn't talk about it. So the new generation, which is related to the second point, which is that the new generation, the internal problem. So internal changes, the new generation, the new MZ generation, they fed up with how the government is handling with the Chinese actions that is not based on international rule. So that sort of inspired this new government to talk about this rule-based and the norm-based, international norm-based activities along with the United States and other countries. And under the previous administration, 386 generation, now they are 586. It's 30 years old, it's 30 years old, 80, they went to college in the 80s and they were born in 60s. That was like 20 years ago or something. But they were like the driving force of Korean democratization, and now they become in the power under this previous administration. So they were then 50 years old, 80. They were born in 80s, and they were they went to college in 80s, and they were born in 60s. So it's a 586 generation, and that oftentimes they de-emphasize the importance of the U.S.-Korea alliance. And even, the Korean ambassador to the United States, he mentioned the very interesting stuff, such as, alliance is important, but, alliance should be based on interests. If the US-Korea alliance doesn't serve the Korean interests, then, it's possible that the alliance is not gonna hold, right? So that is really problematic for younger generation in Korea. And also these other people in Korea. So I think it's the domestic factors and international factors combined that makes the President Yoon emphasize the more like democratic and rule-based and the cooperation with United States and other countries.
Thank you. I'll take a last round of questions from Emil. And do we have a question online? No? So Emil, last question.
Thank you. So my name is Emil. I'm a graduate student at Queen's University, and I actually have two questions. The first one is specifically for Professor Jackson. So you talked about the division within the Japanese government between dovish and hawkish faction. And my question is quite simple, is which faction would you say right now is the most dominant in the government? And then my second question is for the entire panel. Say the unthinkable happens and there is a failure of deterrence and China takes over Taiwan, or there's a failure to react from the United States. How would that be perceived by the different countries that you've studied? And what would be the reaction and the implications for their belief in extending deterrence and security guarantees from the United States?
Okay, the first one, hawks and doves. I'd be flipped to say that doves are extinct in Japan. They're certainly dormant or nesting at this point. And some of that is that, a lot of the real pro-China types really came up in the 1970s during Tanaka Kakue's prime ministership and during the Cold War when Russia was the enemy and China was our friend. China, it was like the Quad. And now that's largely going away. There is one tiny wrinkle, and that's called the Komeito, which is the Japanese. It's a Buddhist-based party that's absolutely pacifistic, and it is actually a coalition partner with the LDP in the Diet. It's not that large, and it doesn't make the difference between LDP being in power, but it's been there since 2012. So it's this long-term stable partner that they have that they kind of defer to. You know, it's been one of the other brakes on LDP bellicosity. That has some possibility, but I think right now, very little. You know, if necessary, the LDP can jettison the Comité, and they'll still be reelected at that time. That's as of 2020. One of the disturbing prospects is that, you know, we have, after the House of Councilors election this summer, 2025 is the deadline for the next diet in the House of Representatives in the diet. And what will the world be like then? I don't know. The doves may come out of hiding at that point, particularly if, you know, Taiwan does something stupid, you know, declares independence, you know, and that would be one possibility for the doves reasserting themselves. The other, you know, disturbing prospect is the trade asymmetry between Japan and China. Japan needs China trade far more than the vice versa. You know, that, you know, and it's been on that way since 1990. Is that it's I didn't have time to show you the charts because, well, you know, I didn't have enough time. You can see this. Yeah, so China's trade with Japan, it's imports from Japan are about 7%. Its exports to Japan are about 5% of its total, whereas now Japanese imports from China are over 20%. Its exports are over 15%. You know, Japan needs China economically. And so this is another thing that might bring some doves out, you know, from the nest and change things in 2025. And so, you know, we'll just have to see where that goes.
So, very interesting scenario to contemplate the failure of deterrence if the United States weren't to defend Taiwan and Taiwan was to fall to Chinese control. Obviously, there's, you know, we talked about this, a lot of this, you could have another conference on that, really, but in terms of the reactions in Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, Japan, Korea, there would be, already we're seeing, and I put up a graph there of the Thai perceptions of US-China influence. There's already an eclipse of US influence, perceptions of US influence. I think that's pretty much the case across Southeast Asia. Perhaps the least so in Singapore, which is, you know, a host of US facilities. For Australia, the concern is mostly about Indonesia because it's our biggest neighbour and our most important neighbour, the largest Muslim democracy in the world, country 10 times our population, sitting astride our trade routes. It's very significant for us which way Indonesia leans, and Australia invests a considerable amount of its diplomatic effort on maintaining, well, it's patchy on this. We have a game of snakes and ladders in our relationship with Indonesia. We, you know, incrementally go up the ladder, and then over beef, votes, spies, clemency, Papua, Timor, Jerusalem, we poke them in the eye, and down the snake we come. We're not very good at playing the Indonesia game, unfortunately. We need to improve considerably, but it is symptomatic of, for us, the significance of that. And Hyon wrote a book called How to Defend Australia, which I have a number of issues with on a number of fronts, but one of the points he makes, which I think is really interesting, is that we have the option to accommodate or to ramp up, seriously ramp up. And I said, he doesn't quite explicitly say that, but he says we might as well accommodate, effect implicitly, because his scenario for ramping up is just so ridiculously expensive. Why would you bother, right? That's his answer. That's his argument. But I think the only other option for Australia is to, you know, seriously ramp up on the World War II scale, ramping up, because I think there is, I don't think there's, and I think the experience of 1942 demonstrates that Australia remains of enduring significance for the United States, regardless of who's in office in the White House or in Canberra. There is to my mind, there is a alignment of interests that is of considerable endurance. That is, I can't see that changing anytime soon. And so, you know, people talk about values, they talk about defense of democracy. Yes, it's all nice, but it's overlapping interests. That is, if you don't have overlapping interests, then it doesn't work. And in this sense, there is, and it is partly values, but it's an interest in not having an authoritarian empire stifle your way of life and your ability to engage with the world. And I think that's what's really come clear in the last few years under President Xi, is this is far less benign, far more authoritarian, far more assertive than we had anticipated or are comfortable with, and we are therefore prepared to pay the price. And that, I think, is the bottom line. Australia is probably more prepared to pay the price than we've been for generations.
If the question is about the South Korea's, how South Korea respond if United States fail to defend Taiwan, right? It's gonna be the worst case scenario for South Korea, of course. And the most important thing is the credibility of the United States is gonna be detrimental because of this failure. And I'm not sure if the US alliance could be maintained because of that. And I mean, the alliance members, including Korea, Japan, Australia, and other countries, would be curious. I mean, you would question the US capability in protecting this regional prosperity and security. And so that this alliance relationship, I don't know if the alliance relationship could be maintained if the US fails to do so. But at the same time, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that the alliance is gonna be, alliance is gonna collapse, but you know, the people will question the US capacity and also the US, the US capacity. And then second one is that if it is so, if it happens, that's a worst case scenario, but the interactions are still ongoing. I mean, it's the interaction between Korea and China will still ongoing because of the importance of China to South Korea. The China, as I said, the China is the #1 trading partner for South Korea. And interestingly, Taiwan is the #5. So that means that Taiwan is not, you know, unimportant, but, you know, you compare this difference between these two, the Korea has more, I mean, inclination toward the China instead of Taiwan. But of course, if you think about this value, democratic value and other things, that of course you have to be in part of protecting Taiwan. And I mean, it's the South Korea has to, you know, find a way to be along with the United States, not to lose a war if a war ever happens. So I mean, it should not happen, of course.
So if I understand you all well, in the worst case scenario, none of these countries will get nuclear, will go nuclear. Okay. On that note, we'll take a 15-minute break and we'll come back for the next panel on how other partners in the region are handling the Taiwan question. Thank you very much to our panelists.
Thank you.
For this very insightful discussion. Thank you.